Elvis Presley pulled Johnny aside backstage and whispered something that changed everything. This was the night the king of late night was finally going to meet the king of rock and roll. But the only thing that materialized was a crushing, unforgettable silence. Johnny Carson stood at center stage, the spotlight finding him as he adjusted his tuxedo, the master of ceremonies ready to introduce the biggest guest of his career. It was late 1970, and the rumors had been flying for weeks. Elvis Presley was not only coming to The Tonight Show, but he was going to perform a rare, stripped-down set. For Johnny, the host who valued control and quiet elegance, having the whirlwind that was Elvis on his stage was a monumental concession, a move only made possible by the incredible ratings it promised. He stood there, waiting for the segment to start, and for the first time in his career, he felt genuinely nervous, less like a host and more like a humble subject awaiting his monarch. The music swelled, the camera focused, and Johnny delivered a monologue that was sharp, witty, and perfectly timed, but beneath the veneer of cool confidence, he was distracted. He knew how important this was for the network, for the audience, and perhaps most importantly, for the cultural conversation of America. Then, during the final commercial break before the scheduled interview, a frantic Fred de Cordova, the executive producer, materialized by the curtain, his face sheet white. He didn't whisper. He hissed the devastating news. "He's not coming, Johnny," Colonel Parker called. "Elvis is still in Los Angeles, but he's not coming." The disappointment that swept through the studio when the show returned and Johnny smoothly introduced a second-tier comedian instead of Elvis was palpable. Johnny, ever the professional, made a joke about Elvis's wardrobe budget leading to a flat tire, but inside, he was stung. He felt personally betrayed. It was an ultimate rejection from the only man whose celebrity rivaled his own. Elvis had proven there were stars whose orbits were too wild even for Carson's gravitational pull. But here is the detail the audience never knew. As Johnny was wrapping up, a discreet courier, a man from the shadowy, higher security world of rock and roll royalty, approached Fred de Cordova. He simply handed Fred a folded piece of heavy stock paper, sealed with a recognizable, ornate gold stamp, marking a protected request from the king. Fred, utterly confused, opened the note. It wasn't an apology. It was a cryptic request, carrying the weight of a decree. "Tell Mr. Carson that the king wants a private audience. Tonight, after the show." Johnny Carson, who had just covered the massive hole left by Elvis's absence, was about to find out that the man who stood him up still desperately needed him. If you love hearing the secret, human stories behind the bright lights of Hollywood's legends, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now. We have 9 more exclusive sections detailing this incredible, secret encounter coming your way. The note was a match thrown onto a gasoline spill, audacious, demanding, and impossible to ignore. It demanded a secret meeting on December 3rd, 1971, in the night at NBC Studios, Burbank, nearly a year after the infamous snub. Johnny Carson, the man who meticulously controlled every aspect of his life and his show, hated this kind of chaos. Yet the sheer nerve of the request held his attention captive. Johnny Carson and Elvis Presley, they were the two undisputed kings of American celebrity, yet they occupied entirely separate galaxies. Carson was the elegant, meticulous craftsman. His power lay in the perfectly tailored suit, the controlled smirk, and the ability to hold a nation's attention with a raised eyebrow. Elvis was pure, beautiful, magnificent chaos. His power was raw, vibrating energy, gold-threaded jumpsuits, and a legion of fans who believed he could walk on water. The king of late night was the ultimate gatekeeper of culture, deciding who was allowed entry into the American living room. The king of rock and roll was the cultural force that broke all the gates down just by showing up. For a private meeting to happen, one of these kings would have to cross into the other's territory, and the tension of that trespass was electrifying. Fred de Cordova, sweating beneath the stage lights, handed Johnny the note as the credits rolled. "We need to call security, Johnny. We can't just let him walk in here." Johnny took the note and smoothed out the heavy paper. "No, Fred," he replied, his voice low, his blue eyes holding a dangerous gleam. "If he wants a private audience, he gets a private audience. Tonight, we treat him like a sovereign, not a celebrity." Johnny understood this was a massive risk to his clean reputation, inviting chaos into his controlled empire. He knew the underlying truth. Elvis was not afraid of The Tonight Show. He was afraid of disappointing the audience, afraid of being exposed as anything less than the myth. The cancellation had been a surrender to fear, and now, this request was a desperate attempt to reclaim control, one-on-one. The logistics arranged by Elvis's small, covert detail were absurdly complex. They used a service entrance near the loading dock, a door usually reserved for large crates and prop storage. The code word to gain entry was not a name, but a number 747, the exact number of stitches on a regulation baseball, known only to a handful of people in Elvis's inner circle. No press, no cameras, and absolutely no announcement was the mandate. The story the world would hear the next day was that Elvis was quietly flying back to Memphis. The only people who would know the truth were Johnny, Fred, and a large, silent man standing guard by the entrance. Johnny dismissed everyone else. He was left alone on the set, the familiar warmth of the audience now replaced by the cold, vast emptiness of the studio. He felt a mixture of annoyance and deep, professional curiosity. He knew this meeting wouldn't be about comedy or publicity. It felt more like a strange, midnight summit between two rivals, one of whom was clearly crumbling under the weight of his own kingdom. He sat back in his desk chair, the red velvet curtain shimmering behind him. The great irony of their shared lives was their isolation. Both men lived inside a velvet cage of their own making. Now, in the dark, one king was coming to ask the other for help. The applause had faded to silence hours ago. The cameras were draped in black cloth, and the famous studio lights were reduced to a handful of work lamps casting long, distorted shadows across the empty set. It was 1:30 in the morning, and the hollow space of the Tonight Show stage felt less like the epicenter of comedy and more like a cathedral awaiting a midnight confession. Johnny Carson was the only man still seated. He remained behind his famous desk, fiddling with a pen, the perfect picture of controlled impatience. Beside him, Fred de Cordova nervously checked his watch every 30 seconds, the only noise besides the rhythmic, slow ticking. In the darkness, the studio felt oppressive, a mausoleum of forgotten laughs. Johnny wasn't angry anymore. He was intensely curious. What could possibly be so important that the biggest star on the planet would risk a secret journey just to speak to him privately? The king of rock and roll had stood up the Tonight Show itself, but tonight, he was bowing before the man. Johnny finally broke the silence, his voice quiet. If he wants an audience, he should show up, Fred. He wasn't joking. This was Johnny's time, the precious few hours he reserved for himself, and he hated having it wasted on Hollywood melodrama. He knew Elvis was surrounded by people who shielded him from reality, who protected the myth at all costs. But Johnny was the ultimate realist, and he expected punctuality, even from a legend. Yet, as the minutes dragged on, the initial annoyance began to soften, replaced by something close to empathy. Johnny remembered the chaos that followed Elvis's non-appearance, the speculation that he was erratic, unstable, or unwell. He looked at the guest couch, the very spot where thousands of the world's most powerful and funny people had sat, and imagined Elvis sitting there, stripped of the veneer of performance. What if the man who embodied American freedom was the loneliest man in America? Suddenly, the heavy door near the orchestra pit, a door rarely used, groaned open. The three men, Johnny, Fred, and the large security man all turned their attention to the darkness. There was a pause, a moment where the entire studio seemed to hold its breath. Then, a figure stepped into the weak light. He wasn't wearing white leather or sequined silk. He was wearing dark glasses and a simple, black velvet suit, and he moved with a slow, almost painful deliberation that erased 20 years of famous, frenetic energy. This was not the Elvis that 20,000 screaming fans fought to touch. This was a man struggling against the gravitational pull of his own immense fame, entering the territory of another king, simply seeking a moment of peace. Johnny finally stood up from his desk, allowing the king of rock and roll to step onto his set without an introduction, without a band, and without the protective wall of the audience. The meeting was finally about to begin, and the only sound was the faint, rhythmic shuffling of Elvis's custom-made shoes on the famous polished floor. When the man who was arguably the most famous person on earth finally stepped onto that stage, the first thing anyone noticed wasn't the charisma or the power, but the profound, heartbreaking weariness. This wasn't the dazzling king. This was a ghost of a man, seemingly weighed down by the invisible crown of his own celebrity. The suit was a simple, dark, velvet tracksuit, Expensive, yes, but looked like a costume for a sad sleepwalker. Deliberately understated, an almost desperate attempt to be seen as a person, not a monument. Johnny, who had been expecting a demanding ego, instead saw a man who looked like he hadn't had a proper night's sleep in 5 years. The tragedy wasn't in the absence of the flash, it was in the presence of profound exhaustion. Elvis moved slowly, his posture slightly slumped, the dark sunglasses concealing the eyes that had captivated millions. Johnny, ever the host, walked around his desk, extending a hand. "Elvis," he said, his voice neutral. "I'm glad you could finally make it." Elvis took the hand, his grip surprisingly limp. "Mr. Carson," he replied, his voice a low, gravelly drawl that lacked the familiar bounce. "Thank you for waiting. I know this is an imposition." The initial small talk was agonizingly awkward. It was two titans, suddenly reduced to two regular men who had absolutely no common vocabulary outside of the show business they both dominated but clearly felt trapped by. They spoke about the weather, about the temperature of the studio, about anything but the reason they were there. Fred de Cordova, sensing the tension, quietly excused himself, leaving only Johnny, Elvis, and the silent, massive bodyguard who stood near the curtain like a sentry guarding a secret. Johnny motioned to the guest couch. "Please, sit down." Elvis sank onto the famous velvet cushions, the same spot where he should have sat hours earlier under the blinding lights. The camera operators would later say that for the first time in his life, Elvis looked small on the Tonight Show set. Johnny took the seat opposite him, leaning forward slightly. He decided to abandon the celebrity script entirely. "Elvis," he said gently, "we both know why you didn't come earlier. The crowd, the pressure. It's too much sometimes, isn't it?" Elvis took off his sunglasses, and what Johnny saw was the raw, unadorned truth. The eyes of a 40-year-old man who hadn't been able to leave his house without a platoon in nearly 20 years. The vulnerability was stunning. It wasn't about the jokes or the ratings anymore. This was two human beings, sitting in the darkness, both trapped inside their colossal lives. It was Johnny's quiet, empathetic question that finally broke the ice, cutting through the layers of fame and isolation. He wasn't asking the king a question. He was asking Elvis Presley. The silence stretched, and then the king of rock and roll began to speak, not about music or movies, but about the terrible, paralyzing loneliness of having everything. The king of rock and roll, lonely and exhausted. It makes you realize celebrity is often just a fancy cage. Have you ever met a hero or a famous person who seems sad or lonely beneath the surface? Drop a comment below and share your story. The moment Elvis removed his sunglasses, the protective shield dissolved, and the great stage of The Tonight Show instantly became a space of raw, unexpected intimacy. Johnny Carson wasn't looking at a legend. He was looking into the eyes of a man pleading for help, silently drowning in the ocean of his own fame. Elvis leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped tightly. He spoke in a low, earnest tone that was startlingly different from his famous performing voice. He confessed that the constant adoration had become a relentless burden. He talked about the isolation of being surrounded by people who only said yes, who catered to the king, but neglected Elvis Aaron Presley. He spoke about the terror of stepping onto a stage, not knowing if he was still magnificent, or if he had become a tired imitation of the man who once thrilled the world. "I look at you, Mr. Carson," Elvis admitted, his voice catching slightly, "and I see a man who still gets to be himself. You walk out there, you tell your jokes, you control the moment, you own the stage. Me? I just wear the costume and sing the songs I sang 20 years ago. Sometimes I feel like a joke, like a museum piece." That word joke hung in the cavernous silence of the studio. For the king of rock and roll, the man who defined American cool, to use that word, it was worse than a major health issue. It was the sound of a dream, failing. It stripped away every layer of sequin and security detail, revealing the fundamental fear of obsolescence that haunts every true performer. Johnny listened patiently, letting the silence breathe. He realized Elvis hadn't come for an interview. He had come for a therapist, a fellow prisoner in the velvet cage of supreme celebrity. Johnny finally reached out and placed his hand lightly on Elvis's arm, a gesture of profound, uncharacteristic compassion. "Elvis," he said, gently. You could never be a joke. You changed the world. But I understand the prison. People look at us and see the symbol, the paycheck, the icon. They don't see the man who goes home alone and wonders if any of it is real. This moment was an emotional breakthrough. It was the first time in years Elvis had been seen by a peer, not as a commodity, but as a vulnerable human being. He nodded slowly, pulling a handkerchief from his pocket to lightly touch the corner of his eye. His fame had bought him everything, yet it had stolen the simple comfort of shared understanding. He was the greatest star in the universe, and he was desperately lonely. He had come to the only other man who understood that level of isolation, needing to hear that the prison was not his alone. He looked at Johnny, a flicker of the old charisma returning to his eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Carson," he whispered. "You don't know how much I needed to hear that. I came here tonight to ask you something important, something only you can do." The admission had been made, the bond had been sealed, and now, the true, unexpected purpose of the secret meeting was about to be revealed. Johnny Carson, the king of cool, leaned forward and shared something he had kept fiercely private for years. A moment of personal frailty he had never discussed with a colleague, let alone the colossal figure sitting opposite him. This was the moment their two isolated worlds finally touched. He spoke about the overwhelming weight of expectation, not from his audience, but from his family, the constant need to be charming, successful, and perpetually on. He confessed to the quiet ache of knowing that while he was a fixture in millions of homes every night, he often felt like a stranger on his own. He spoke of the sheer exhaustion of having to build the persona of Johnny Carson every single day, and the profound relief of simply being John William, the man who liked magic tricks and quiet time. Elvis listened intently, his famous eyes shining with a sudden, new light of recognition. This was the language of shared monarchy, a conversation only two men at the absolute peak of power could ever truly have. It wasn't about contracts or hits or movies. It was about the simple, agonizing fact that fame had purchased them endless luxury, but had demanded their humanity as the price. They were two kings, sitting silently on the same throne of celebrity, realizing they were equally burdened by the velvet robes. "They just want the icon," Elvis whispered, stating the central tragedy of his life. "The idea of me. They don't want the man who sometimes gets tired." "We give them the icon because we have to," Johnny replied, his voice soft but firm. "It's the contract. We get applause, but we lose the right to be regular. But you know what they say about that, Elvis? It's lonely at the top." The tension in the studio began to dissolve, replaced by a deep, genuine camaraderie. Johnny realized that beneath the layers of bodyguards and entourage, Elvis was simply looking for a life raft, a connection to someone who wouldn't judge him for his exhaustion, but who would immediately understand it. They spoke for nearly half an hour longer, two men sharing war stories of a battle only they fought, the war against their own manufactured image. It was a beautiful, human moment that transcended their separate legacies. When they finally lapsed into silence, there was a profound shift in the air. The animosity from the canceled show was gone, replaced by a silent, powerful bond of mutual understanding. It was at this moment, having established that he was talking to a friend and not a host, that Elvis reached into the pocket of his dark tracksuit. The greatest stories are the ones about connection, where two people realize they are not alone. If this moment of shared vulnerability between these two legends touched you, please share this video with a friend who needs a reminder that even the most powerful people struggle in silence. In that powerful, shared silence, having confessed his deepest fears to his greatest rival, Elvis reached into his pocket and pulled out not a handkerchief, nor a pack of cigarettes, but a small, tarnished silver charm. It wasn't glittering or ornate. It was worn smooth by years of constant handling, its details almost rubbed away. This tiny metal, held between his thumb and forefinger, was the entire reason for the secret summit. It was a street Christopher medal, the patron saint of travelers. Elvis gently placed it on the famous glass surface of Johnny's desk. "This belonged to my mother," he explained, his voice low and thick with emotion. "She gave it to me when I started traveling. It's the only thing I've carried for 20 years that hasn't changed. It doesn't care that I'm the king." Johnny Carson, the unflappable man of reason, was stunned into silence. He reached out and touched the cool, aged metal. He expected a request for money, for a huge favor, or for a public platform. Instead, he was being shown the single, most vulnerable object in Elvis Presley's entire world. My biggest fear, Elvis continued, his eyes locked on the metal, is that I won't be remembered for the music or for making people happy. I'll be remembered for the circus, for the mistakes, for the times I couldn't face the lights. He looked up at Johnny. I have a cousin, back in Tupelo. She's been struggling since her husband passed away. She always told people that I was kind. She believes in the real me, but I'm too isolated now. I can't even pick up a phone and call her without it being a major event. Here was the profound, stunning truth of the request. Elvis needed Johnny Carson, the master of communication and quiet influence, to become his private, unseen bridge back to humanity. I want you to write her a letter, Elvis requested, his eyes pleading. A simple letter, on your stationery. Just tell her that you and I met, that we talked about her, and that I promised I'd look after her family. Tell her I still remember the man I was before the fame got so loud. The request wasn't for public recognition. It was for private validation, a desperate, whispered plea for dignity for both himself and his struggling relative. Johnny didn't hesitate. He took the medal into his own hand, feeling the warmth of its history. Consider it done, Johnny stated, his voice now imbued with the seriousness of a sacred promise. No camera, no story, no joke. A simple promise. Between two men, they had established a bond of mutual vulnerability in the dark, and now, Elvis was asking Johnny to seal that bond with an act of unseen, pure, human kindness. The secret meeting had shifted from a summit of rivalry to a silent pact of redemption. Johnny knew he was about to fulfill the quiet, final wish of a very lonely king. The gravity of the moment settled over the studio. Elvis stood up, looking taller and stronger than he had when he walked in. The transaction was complete, but before the bodyguard could usher him toward the hidden exit, Elvis paused, turning back to Johnny with an intense gaze that made Carson lean in. This was the moment of the whisper, the message that would change Johnny Carson's life forever. The transaction was complete. Elvis had entrusted his most guarded secret and his mother's sacred medal to Johnny Carson. Now, it was time for the king of rock and roll to retreat back into the night, back into the fortress of his fame. But as he reached the stage door, he stopped, spinning around with a sudden, electrifying intensity that banished the weariness from his face. The air snapped, thick with the unspoken tension of a final curtain call. Elvis walked purposefully back to Johnny, who was still seated on the famous guest couch, holding the small, tarnished street Christopher medal. The bodyguard, standing by the shadows, tensed, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. This was not the expected handshake farewell. This was a personal mandate. Elvis leaned down toward Johnny, bringing his face within inches of the late-night host. This was the moment of ultimate proximity, the collision of two massive, guarded legacies. He placed one hand on Johnny's shoulder, a gesture that was both fraternal and urgent. And then, he lowered his voice to a whisper, a sound so quiet, so intimate, that only Johnny and the silent security man could possibly have heard the words hanging in the still air. The words were not about the cousin, nor the press, nor music. They were a 12-word distillation of all the pain, the isolation, and the regret Elvis had carried into that dark studio. When those words landed, they didn't just register in Johnny's ear. They struck him straight in the heart, shattering the practiced composure he had cultivated for 30 years. The sound of the words hit Johnny not like a secret, but like an electric current. He didn't just hear them, he felt the shock travel down his spine. Johnny Carson, the man who never showed weakness, whose career was built on the legendary Carson Cool, actually recoiled slightly on the couch. His eyes went wide, reflecting the emergency lights on the camera booms, and the subtle, perpetual smirk that usually guarded his face vanished, replaced by an expression of profound, immediate shock. He gripped the silver medal so tightly his knuckles turned white. He tried to speak, perhaps to ask a clarifying question, but the words were stuck in his throat. The whisper was devastatingly personal, hitting a nerve deep inside Johnny that no writer, no guest, and no critic had ever managed to touch. It was as if Elvis, in that single, intimate moment, had used his own profound pain to recognize and name Johnny's deepest, most private sorrow. The entire purpose of the meeting suddenly clicked into place. It wasn't just about a lonely cousin. It was about the desperate, final need for one king to leave a meaningful message for another, a warning born of shared tragedy. Before Johnny could compose himself, Elvis straightened up, gave a fleeting, sad smile, and walked toward the exit, melting back into the hidden passage as quickly as he had appeared. He had made his promise, and he had delivered his final, powerful message. The studio door closed with a heavy thud, leaving Johnny Carson alone on his iconic set, completely shaken, holding a medal and the weight of a secret. The king had left the building, but his words remained, vibrating in the silence. The heavy steel door clicked shut, plunging the studio back into a quiet that was now heavier, more loaded with meaning than before. Johnny Carson remained motionless on the guest couch, his hand still frozen near his ear, the weight of Elvis's 12-word whisper settling over him like a shroud. He was profoundly shaken, and for several long minutes, he did not move. He was not thinking about the ratings, the jokes, or the schedule for tomorrow's show. He was thinking about how a man he barely knew, a rival, a fellow monarch in the kingdom of fame, had just distilled his own decades of private regret into a single, devastating sentence aimed directly at Johnny's heart. Finally, he stood up, running a hand through his perfectly coiffed hair, and walked slowly back to his desk. He sat down in his chair and looked at the famous couch, now empty. He opened his hand, gazing at the silver street, Christopher medal, the promise he now carried. And then, the narrator can finally reveal the core of the mystery, the message that changed the king of late night forever. Elvis's whisper was, "Don't let the audience become your only family, or the silence will destroy you." Those words, so simple, yet so devastatingly accurate, hit Johnny precisely because they named the silent tragedy of his life. Everyone knew of Johnny's guarded nature, his difficulty maintaining deep relationships, and the famous distance he kept from everyone, even his own children. He was married to the show, devoted to the audience, and he poured every ounce of his humanity into those 2 hours of nightly performance. Elvis, a man facing his own personal destruction due to isolation, saw Johnny's future written in the loneliness of his own life. It was a warning whispered across the chasm of their shared fame. The tears that finally came were not big, dramatic sobs. They were quiet, private tears of painful recognition. Johnny had spent his entire adult life keeping the world at bay, laughing off emotion, protecting himself with layers of cool irony. But this one moment, this single, intimate warning from a fellow king, had broken through all the walls. Elvis hadn't come for an interview. He had come to leave a desperate, loving note from the future. Johnny knew, in the quiet depth of that moment, that he had to honor the promise to Elvis's cousin. More importantly, he had to heed the warning. He looked around his empty studio, the place that was supposed to be his home, and understood that if he didn't fight for a life outside those walls, the silence would eventually consume him, too. The king of rock and roll had checked out of his own life, but not before giving the king of late night a final, tear-jerking lesson on what truly mattered. Johnny gathered the medal and left the studio, walking out the front door into the Los Angeles night, carrying the weight of 2 great lives. He knew the world would never know what happened in the dark, but he would never forget the truth. He met Elvis to offer help, but he left with a fragile, precious gift. The next night, when Johnny Carson walked out onto the Tonight Show stage, he was the same impeccably tailored, quick-witted host the audience adored, yet those who knew him best sensed a profound, quiet alteration. He was still the king of late night, but now his eyes held a deeper, more empathetic understanding, a knowledge born from a conversation held in the dark with a fellow sovereign. Johnny kept his promise immediately. The very next morning, before he even looked at the cue cards for the upcoming show, he sat down and wrote a personal letter to Elvis's cousin in Tupelo. It was written on the official NBC Tonight Show stationery, but the words were purely personal. He told her how highly Elvis spoke of her, confirmed that the king was thinking of her, and assured her that he, Johnny Carson, was instructed to personally ensure she never had another moment of financial worry. He didn't mention the medal or the midnight meeting. He simply made a silent, sweeping gesture of support in Elvis's name. The letter was signed, simply, "A friend of Elvis." That letter, and the subsequent financial support Johnny quietly provided for years, was the visible legacy of the meeting. But the true, unseen legacy was the transformation of Johnny Carson himself. Elvis's 12-word warning, "Don't let the audience become your only family, or the silence will destroy you," lodged itself permanently in Johnny's psyche. It acted as a necessary governor on his relentless ambition and isolation. Over the next few years, Johnny began to subtly adjust his priorities. He began to spend more time away from the studio, investing in hobbies like sailing and photography, deliberately seeking out quiet moments away from the applause. He began to reach out to old friends, not colleagues, but true, personal friends, from before the massive fame set in. He guarded his private time fiercely, making it clear that his personal life was no longer up for public consumption. People close to him said he became more patient, less defensive, and strangely, more content with the vast, quiet world outside the studio walls. When Elvis passed away tragically in 1977, Johnny never spoke about their meeting publicly. It was a sacred trust, a secret shared between two men who understood the loneliness of fame too well. When reporters inevitably brought up Elvis's life, Johnny would offer a brief, sincere compliment to the king's talent, quickly changing the subject with a practiced joke. But in his private desk drawer, years later, the production staff would find a small, tarnished silver street, Christopher metal, polished smooth by time and memory. Elvis came to The Tonight Show that night seeking a connection to humanity and left behind a life-altering gift for the host. He provided the king of late night with the one thing money, fame, and success could never purchase: a clear-eyed warning and a path toward personal peace. The world saw Johnny Carson the star, but for the rest of his life, he carried the quiet wisdom whispered to him by the most magnificent, fragile king America ever produced. He learned that the greatest performance of all is the one you give for your own soul, even when no one is watching. The street, Christopher Metal, was a reminder of a promise kept, but the whisper was the key to a life unlocked. Elvis may have met his end tragically, but his final act was saving his friend from the same profound isolation that consumed him. This story is a powerful reminder that behind every dazzling legend is a human being seeking connection. If this secret history of Johnny Carson and Elvis Presley resonated with you, show your support. Hit the like button right now to help this story reach others who need to remember the human side of fame. And click subscribe for more untold stories from the golden age of Hollywood. We'll keep bringing you the secrets, the heartaches, and the moments that define our favorite stars.